On June 23, 2026, the first light over Hormuz looked like molten copper spilled across a knife edge of water. Most people think choke points are won by missiles, courage, and flags snapping in the salt wind. That is the public myth. The private truth is uglier, because the strait was never just a battlefield. It was a ledger, a balance sheet, and a countdown toward bankruptcy and insolvency. That morning, the tankers moved like floating vaults, each hull packed with crude, credit, and political oxygen for half the planet. Every wake carried insurance premiums, bond prices, refinery schedules, and the quiet fear of markets that hate uncertainty more than blood. Traders in London felt it before sailors did. The sea looked calm, but the books were already screaming. For years, the world treated Hormuz like a permanent miracle, a narrow corridor, barely breathing room for giant ships, yet carrying roughly a fifth of global oil flows. That kind of dependence does something to governments. It makes them superstitious, then reckless, then blind. Iran understood that blindness better than anyone. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps never needed to win a grand naval war in open water. It only needed to make movement expensive, fear contagious, and time unaffordable. In modern conflict, the winning side is often the side that can force the other man to pay more. At its peak, the regional order looked untouchable. American carrier groups glided like steel cities, Gulf capitals glowed with mirrored towers, and the oil kingdoms threw money at ports, pipelines, and prestige. Gold watches flashed in palaces. Fighter jets roared over parades. Everything looked permanent because power always tries to dress like eternity. The maps were clean, the sea lanes polished, and the energy system looked engineered by gods with spreadsheets. But beneath the surface, the foundation was rotting. It was rotting because too much of the world still trusted one thin strip of water. That was the addiction. Not oil alone, but concentration. Too much crude through one artery, too much profit through one funnel, too much political confidence tied to uninterrupted transit. Dependency is just death wearing a good suit. The monster in this story was not a general with medals. It was the market itself, backed by underwriters, freight contracts, sovereign budgets, and the cold stare of the oil screen. The antagonist had no face, because it was a number. Once ship in risk jumped, everybody bled. Iran built its trap around that truth. Mines were cheap. Fast boats were cheap. Drones were cheap. Panic, however, was priceless. For a state under sanctions, pressure became doctrine. Every barrel delayed could spike prices by dollars. Every insurance revision could drain millions from shippers before a single ship burned. Think about the scale of that. By June 24th, freight risk models were being rewritten in real time. War risk premiums reportedly jumped from roughly 0.2% toward 1.8% on high-value tanker routes. On a $120 million vessel, the change felt like a punch to the throat. The math was the weapon. Then came the first shock. 3 commercial captains reported navigational warnings. 2 support craft vanished from tracking patterns, and 1 tanker halted after a suspected seabed contact. Oil lurched from $82 to $97 in hours. Natural gas futures followed like stray sparks in dry grass. The old mistake is believing disruption needs spectacle. It does not. It needs doubt. Once doubt enters the channel, every captain becomes an accountant, and every accountant becomes a coward. By June 25th, the trap had 3 layers. The first was the mine threat, invisible and patient. The second was swarm harassment from fast boats carrying rockets, guns, and enough explosives to turn caution into paralysis. The third was the drone cloud above it all, feeding eyes, decoys, and targeting data into the same suffocating machine. Tehran's wager was brutally simple. Stretch the crisis long enough, and Washington would face a dirty choice between escalation and economic embarrassment. If America hesitated, shipping costs would soar, Gulf allies would panic, and energy consumers would pay the ransom anyway. The trap was military theater built on financial arithmetic, but the wager carried its own poison. Iran was also chained to the same market it was trying to terrorize. It could disrupt the artery, yes, but it could not stop breathing. That is where the ledger turned vicious. Iran's shadow economy needed high prices, smuggling flows, and enough maritime ambiguity to keep money moving through hidden channels. A brief shock helped, a prolonged closure did not. Once surveillance tightened and interdiction widened, the same pressure campaign that hurt rivals also strong-lad Iran's own cash corridors. That is the secret nobody cheering escalation wants to admit. Black markets are still markets. Sanctioned oil still needs buyers, tankers, payments, and quiet middlemen. Once the sea becomes a police line, illicit finance starts drowning first. Washington saw that opening almost immediately. It did not begin with speeches. It began with a cold financial and military fusion, the kind of move empires prefer when they want the headlines later and the advantage now. The United States pulled what many in the region called a brutal move. It treated reopening Hormuz not as a naval rescue, but as a foreclosure. The goal was not simply to clear boats and mines. The goal was to liquidate the entire business model behind the trap. First came surveillance saturation, satellites, patrol aircraft, drones, cyber units, and signal analysts compressed the Gulf into a living spreadsheet of motion, ownership, and probable intent. Patterns that once hidden noise started glowing. Smugglers, handlers, militia proxies, and launch crews became entries on the same hunting list. Then came the shipping corridor play. Coalition escorts did not promise total safety. They promised enough predictability for insurers and charterers to begin calculating again. That one shift mattered more than most air. Once risk becomes calculable, panic starts to die. By June 26th, underwriters were already splitting routes into tiers instead of treating the entire strait like a death sentence. Limited confidence returned. Crude eased from $97 to $91, and the first crack appeared in the IRGC's pressure campaign. But Washington kept going. It tightened sanctions enforcement on facilitators, front companies, and tanker operators tied to the gray network financing maritime disruption. Bank channels were squeezed. Port access warnings multiplied. The message was savage. If you touch the trap, you inherit the trap's death. This is where wars become noir. Nobody sees the bullet that matters. It is a denied payment, a frozen transfer, an insurer stepping away, a captain refusing a contract. It is a spreadsheet homicide. The shooting still mattered, of course. By June 27th, helicopters and strike aircraft were reportedly hammering small boat staging areas, fuel caches, radar nodes, and launch platforms near the coast. A swarm can terrify a convoy. It cannot survive repeated precision. The numbers began to tell the story. 12 boats lost, 7 damaged, 4 launch sites blackened, 2 drone relays silenced. The gold was gone. The credit was frozen. The initiative had turned away. By June 28th, the United States and its partners pushed into the mine problem. That is, slow work, nerve work, coffin work. Every suspicious shape under the water could be steel, coral, junk, or the end of a man's career. Clearance crews moved like accountants touching cursed ledgers. Unmanned systems became the heroes nobody films properly. Surface drones scanned lanes meter by meter. Underwater vehicles mapped anomalies, tagged threats, and handed the most lethal chores to specialists and controlled charges. Technology did what flesh should never be asked to do. Still, the trap might have held if Iran's command structure stayed coherent. Pressure campaigns need rhythm, sequencing, and confidence from the men issuing orders. Once that rhythm breaks, fear spreads inward. A trap can backfire before the enemy even notices. The smoking gun came in a room with weak air conditioning and too much stale coffee. On June 29th, according to later accounts, a crisis meeting reviewed the costs of sustaining the operation for just 10 more days. The figures were ruinous. Replacement drones, boat losses, covert shipping disruptions, and enforcement blowback were chewing through an estimated $480 million equivalent. That document mattered more than any missile footage. It was the real obituary. The meeting was not about victory anymore. It was about cash burn. One paraphrased line from that exchange survived and later we can close the lane for days, a finance officer warned, but we cannot afford the invoice for success. That was the brutal reality. Not defeat by firepower alone, but defeat by operating costs. The Americans understood what that meant. If the trap cost Iran more each day than it cost the market, the campaign was already inverted. Washington did not need a perfect military triumph. It needed Iran to look at its own books and flinch. So the next move was merciless. Coalition forces publicized enough mine-clearing success, escort reliability, and interdiction data to calm traders without calming Tehran, that kept partial confidence alive for commerce while preserving uncertainty for the IRGC's own clandestine network. It was psychological accounting. By July 1st, 2026, transit had not returned to normal, but it had returned to function. Function is everything. Markets do not require perfection. They require continuity. That same week, oil slipped back under $89. Some tankers resumed movement under escort windows. Insurers trimmed the outer edge of their emergency assumptions. The trap, designed to create uncontrollable escalation, was being turned into a manageable surcharge. And that is where the IRGC's design truly backfired. A manageable surcharge can be absorbed. A permanent shutdown cannot. Once Hormuz shifted from apocalypse to expensive inconvenience, Iran lost its leverage and kept its costs. The final collapse was not dramatic on television. No single burning skyline marked the end. Instead, money ran out in stages, like blood soaking through 3 layers of cloth. Fuel reserves for constant small boat operations tightened first. Then, spare parts for drones became harder to route through intermediaries. Then hazard pay climbed as crews understood the survival odds. The operation kept breathing, but only through a financial ventilator. Somewhere in the second week of July, commanders faced the oldest military truth in the world. Men can fight without comfort. They cannot fight without fuel, parts, and cash. Guns need ledgers. That was the default. Not a courtroom declaration. Not a formal confession. A strategic default, where the campaign could no longer be sustained at meaningful scale. And when money runs out, the consequences crawl ashore. Coastal traders stalled. Smuggling brokers vanished. Families dependent on maritime cash flows felt bread prices rise and work disappear. Pride turned sour. Humiliation travels fast in port cities. That is when the deepest rule of this story arrives. Sovereignty is solvency. A state that cannot finance escalation does not control escalation. It rents it briefly until the bill collector arrives. The public sees warships and explosions. The private state sees reserve levels, import channels, payroll risks, and emergency credit needs. One image is glory. The other is the truth. In later whispers, officials described the June 29th meeting as the Gulf's version of a liquidation sale. Keep the trap active and lose the covert fleet. Keep defying escorts and lose the middlemen. Keep spending and starve the next operation before it begins. So the campaign faded. Not all at once. Pressure tactics continued in fragments, threats, and symbolic gestures. But the coherent attempt to hold Hormuz hostage had been foreclosed. The aftermath stretched far beyond the summer. Gulf states accelerated pipeline redundancy, storage expansion, and alternative export routing. Shipping firms rewrote contingency models. Energy ministries bought insurance against geography itself. Let that number sink in. One internal estimate, circulated months later in policy circles, put the total disruption cost above $34 billion across energy markets, insurance, rerouting, naval operations, and delayed cargoes. Yet Iran's own strategic gains were thin. That is the cruelty of bad leverage. You can burn the room and still lose the house. The scar lasted longer than the headlines. Investors remembered. Charter contracts changed. Smuggling networks that once moved with confidence now demanded higher margins, deeper secrecy, and faster payment. Distrust became permanent overhead, and generations always pay for strategic vanity. The emergency financing, hidden procurement losses, and enforcement damage tied to the crisis did not vanish with calmer seas. They rolled forward like a mortgage written in smoke. In this telling, the last serious balance from that summer was not fully settled until 2041. Think about that. A few weeks of brinkmanship, 15 years of economic aftertaste. By 2041, the final check was not a literal paper draft passed across a dramatic table. It was a chain of restructured liabilities, buried subsidies, deferred replacements, and lost capital, finally absorbed by the system. That is how modern empires and anti-empires pay. Quietly, over decades. In invisible installments, children who were not yet born when Hormuz convulsed would inherit the logic of that failure. Higher risk premiums, hardened trade routes, permanent suspicion in maritime finance. A whole generation learning that one reckless strategy can tax the future. That is the real lesson of Hormuz. The sea did not decide the outcome alone. The missiles did not decide it alone. The ledger did, because history is rarely settled by the loudest explosion. More often, it is settled by the side that can keep paying, keep shipping, keep borrowing, and keep eating. Cash is strategy. Credit is ammunition. Oil is blood. So when you hear that the U.S. opened Hormuz with brute force, understand the deeper move. The brutality was not only military, it was financial. Washington turned a trap into a bad investment. And when you hear that the IRGC's plan backfired, do not imagine a simple tactical blunder. Imagine a balance sheet cracking under stress, a coercive machine suffocating on its own costs, and a state discovering that insolvency can be more lethal than air power. It was not only a failed blockade, it was a business collapse. That is why the Strait remains terrifying. Not because it is narrow, though it is, not because weapons are deadly, though they are. It is terrifying because one slim channel can expose the fragile accounting beneath global power. Remember that the next time a government speaks in tongue, look past the flags. Look past the war maps. Ask who holds the cash, who carries the debt, and whose books can survive the storm. That is where the future hides. That is where empires rot. And that is where this channel will keep digging, so you can see the numbers before everyone else sees the smoke. Subscribe. stay close, and stay ahead of the people who still think history is written only by men with guns.